Hello and welcome to Merthyr's Hidden Past, a weekly podcast brought to you by Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Christopher Parry and I work at Cyfarthfa Castle. And this is a podcast about Merthyr Tydfil's history, the town and the borough, but not the history that you can easily find out by just doing a simple search. This is about the history of the town that's a bit more hidden, a bit more less known than the norm. And so hopefully you will find out lots of stories that you may have heard a little about or nothing about at all. And we have many episodes now in. This will be our, what are we, 12th episode I think this would be now. They're all blended in, as I said previous weeks. But yeah, if you want to go back through our back catalogue from episodes 1 to 11 obviously, then you can go to cyfarthfa.com/downloadable content and you'll find a list of all our podcasts there. Some hosted on SoundCloud, some hosted on YouTube, wherever we can get the space, to be honest, at the moment. And so yeah, this week we are going to be looking at an earlier history than we have done in any of the other podcasts. We zoom in right out the industrial period and the 20th century period and all this early recent history, if you want to term it that way. And we're going back to the 13th century. And we're going to look at the foundations of Morlais Castle and the story behind the Battle of Maes Vaynor. Hopefully you may have heard of this and hopefully you've got a bit of a grounding as to what we're going to be talking about. But if you haven't, you don't need to. Just have a listen and hope you enjoy. And as ever, if you like what you hear, please leave some comments, share the podcast as much as possible. Because Cyfarthfa Castle, like many organisations around the world at the moment, are closed to the public. So we are really enjoying engaging with you guys in this way, so definitely engage back with us, talk to us, share, like, subscribe, all that type of thing. And I will shut up now and get on with it, but I hope you enjoy this week's episode. The battle was won by the men of Bohun, and blood like an ocean in Vaynor was seen. That is a little extract from an old Welsh poem that pronounces de Bowen's name slightly different to more Welshified to rhyme with scene. But anyway, our story revolves around Humphrey de Bowen and another Norman lord, the Earl of Gloucestershire, Gilbert de Clare. And yeah, these guys are kind of the main part of our story and the reason why Morlais Castle exists. Merthyr wasn't high on the list of places to build castles at this point in the 1200s. It was all farming land, and there was farming practiced, or at least there's evidence of farming being practiced in the site of Vaynor and the surrounding areas from as early as a couple of thousand BC. There's certainly in Vaynor and the surrounding areas in Merthyr loads of burial cairns and various other objects and artefacts and archaeology still there, hinting towards this very unknown past in Merthyr, really. It's a past that we know little to nothing about. And even the site of Morlais Castle itself is supposedly built upon an earlier Iron Age hill fort. Morlais Castle itself was built around 1288. Now, if we go back slightly, there were obviously Norman warlords all over Wales at this point, trying to quash the Welsh and trying to control Wales and put them under the foot. Now, many castles were being built all around Wales, and the Earl of Gloucestershire, for example, building, Caerphilly Castle and several others. And again, this whole style of conquering, of building castles and fortresses and then using them as strongholds to dominate the landscape is kind of well known and well trodden ground, really, for the Normans in this period. It was how they battled, and this is why Wales has got loads of castles, because they were literally building them all over to try and suppress the local Welsh people and to put them under their rule. Morlais Castle, though, is slightly different because it wasn't built in an area that is specifically needed by anyone, really. It kind of stems from a disagreement between the two lords themselves. Now, the Earl of Herefordshire and Breconshire was Humphrey de Bowen, one of several of the same name, which it always irritates me when people do that in history. They always give the same name throughout for all of time, and so you're never sure which one they're talking about. But as far as we know, it's the third Earl, Humphrey de Bohun, and Gilbert de Clare was the Earl of Gloucestershire. Now, in suppressing a lot of the Welsh armies and things like that, they both fought, and eventually Gilbert de Clare would be given the control of the South Wales forces for the king, who the king at the time being Edward I. The problem with the Norman lords is they never seemed to get on really, most of them. They were all trying to kind of incur and trying to take back little bits of each other's properties. Very, very few of these kind of lords of these vast areas of Wales and other parts of Britain got on really well and never argued at all. And Humphrey de Bohun and Gilbert de Clare were a prime example of this. But either way, Humphrey de Bohun and Gilbert de Clare were clashing quite constantly and consistently over various things, mainly because Gilbert de Clare was pushing in on what he, Humphrey, saw as his land, and so he would push back. But Gilbert de Clare thought it was a bit of an affrontage for him to push back. He didn't like him pushing back, so he tried to assert himself even more. And in trying to assert himself even more, he decided to try and build a castle that overlooked parts of Humphrey de Bohun's land, and that castle being Morlais Castle. So the castle was started and began, some historians say 1286, some say 1288, some as early as 1284, but it's in that time frame really that the building started and commenced. I normally go with 1288 myself because there's slightly more evidence supporting that as a kind of building date, if you get my meaning. And so they started building Morlais Castle, and the idea of Morlais Castle was that it would be a stronghold for Gilbert de Clare to push out onto de Bohun's land from. It wasn't anything to do with anything other than a land grab, essentially. Now, the land the castle was built on was run and owned at that point by Gilbert de Clare, but it was built very strategically to be oppressive to Humphrey de Bohun's land and to push in. And that's what happened, is they kept pushing in and pushing in and pushing in. And before you knew it, the battles and little clashes started to happen. And so the retainers and the people under Humphrey Bohun's, lands picked up arms. These are not kind of, trained soldiers by any stretch of imagination at this point anyway, and they were just defending their areas. Vaynor Church, or at least one incarnation of Vaynor Church, was built by this time, and certainly there was a scattering of houses and farmlands and things like that built at this point, and this is where de Clare's men were pushing at and pushing into, and de Bohun would push back, and the little spats and arguments got so dense that Edward I, the king, decided that he had to step in to stop it escalating, because what he wanted more than anything is peace between the lords. They had just been through all these Welsh battles to try and dominate Wales and the Welsh people, and now all of a sudden the lords are fighting amongst themselves and starting up that whole kind of bloody history again. And so he wanted to stop that and for them to just continue and respect each other's boundaries, essentially. So Edward I contacted both lords and asked them to cease immediately with this kind of attitude. And it seems both of them pretty much arrogantly outright ignored him. And so it just continued on, these little spats, until then, in 1291, Gilbert de Clare's men seemingly pushed a little too hard, and it ended up with an incarnation of Vaynor Church being burnt down, which by that time would have been a wooden structure, or at least it's believed to have been a wooden structure, and predates slightly the older church that's there now. Because in Vaynor, there's two churches, one built in the 19th century by the Crochet family and other people connected, and then the older church that sits just further down from it. And that would have been built after this one was burnt to the ground, and then several people were injured and killed, and so de Bohun and his men felt that they left them with no recourse as to march up to Morlais Castle, meet de Clare's men and battle. They didn't make it all the way up to Morlais Castle. Instead, they lined up in a field. Now, the exact location of the field within Vaynor is a little hard to pinpoint exactly where it is. Certain historians and scholars say that they've kind of got it more or less, in the right area, but I'm always a bit dubious about this type of thing, to be honest. I'm always a bit scared about giving you an exact location, because then if someone else contradicts me, I'll be mortified. But anyway, a field was picked and the two sides clashed, essentially, and that is called the Battle of Maes Vaynor. And in that battle, the two kind of lined up. And when you think of this battle, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as this battle where knights in armour are clashing. This is very much people who were being retained and being given land to run by the lords, and so they would have been farmers and people working on the land. It wouldn't necessarily have been swords and all this type of thing. But either way, the battle happened. The king obviously resented this battle happening and immediately arrested Humphrey de Bohun and Gilbert de Clare and brought them down to see him and to put their case forward of what the heck is going on, because he felt that they had totally disobeyed him and now they're having open warfare on lands, going against everything he's saying. So he brought them down to London, put the two of them on trial, and even though de Bohun was clearly the person who was being pushed against, he said he was being acting in self-defense, which by most accounts is factual, is the truth. And Gilbert de Clare obviously hasn't got much of an argument, because he was just pushing and had arrogance enough to just ignore the king outright. And so what the king did is the king just refused to hear any of the arguments off either of them. He just felt like the crowning offence that they both committed was not the battle itself, but not listening to him saying cease and desist when he did. So they weren't so much being tried for this battle where lots of innocent people eventually lost their lives. And again, we don't know how many people did. There's various mass graves being kind of sighted in and around Vaynor where all the bodies were buried together, but no one knows the extent. No one knows the extent of the size of both sides of the army. No one knows the extent of how many people died, only that there was a mass grave. And there's even the story that's been handed down many generations in Merthyr. The side of a river embankment came down in heavy weather up in Vaynor, and skulls and body parts fell out to the side into the river. And again, that was believed to be possibly the site of this mass grave. But again, sadly, it's not as well known as it should be, really. And either way, Humphrey de Bohun and Gilbert de Clare, their lands were seized and made forfeit, and they were both put in the Tower of London for an indefinite period of time. They were given fines. Humphrey de Bohun had to pay the smaller of the two fines, but either way, they were in the Tower of London. Now, there's a local historian called Charles Wilkins who does a wonderfully kind of detailed and poetic story of Morlais Castle's kind of rise and fall, really. But again, it's difficult to kind of pick out what is factually accurate and what is not. But in his writings, he puts down that Edward I's men then get sent. Well, Edward I rather sends men to Merthyr to pull down the castle, which is obviously being used by Gilbert de Clare to antagonise into the land of Humphrey de Bohun. And so they destroy and take parts of the castle down. At this point, it's not fully understood whether or not the castle was finished at this point, which would be in early 1292, because the trial of the two men happened in January 1292. Now, it's a lot of historians say that Morlais Castle wasn't finished, but even if it wasn't finished, it was very close to being finished. Certainly the exterior walls and a lot of the interior of the castle were done and ready, because it was never meant to be this all singing, all dancing, beautiful architectural kind of stunning castle. It was meant to have sturdy walls, a well inside, a forge to make the metal objects used for all the different variety of parts in the castle, as well as weapons, and places to sleep. And what we call the crypt, but other people thought had different meanings, but that was very ornately decorated and one of the few remaining parts of Morlais Castle. Now and again, if you want to see images of that, just kind of Google Morlais Castle crypt. I'm sure via Google a few images will pop up and you'll see this architecture that I'm on about, that shows a very good stylistic flair to Morlais Castle, that it wasn't just thrown up kind of very crudely. There was some effort put into the stylistic choices there, but it was very much a basic castle anyway. The walls were the most important thing and the towers the most important thing, and again the majority of that were seemingly complete. So it's kind of up to you in terms of how you interpret full completion of the castle. But either way, it's irrelevant because parts of it supposedly were taken down by Edward I to stop the argument happening. And then even much later in the English Civil War, Cromwell's men were marching around all of the Welsh countryside, bringing down the castles because they were being used as strongholds for the opposing army, obviously. And Morlais Castle being one of those, so even more of it was destroyed. But going back now to our two Norman lords, they didn't spend too much time in the Tower of London, it seems. They were certainly back on the streets, if you want to put it like that, by 1294, 1295, because Humphrey de Bohun in particular was fighting battles on behalf of Edward I in Wales and elsewhere in Britain and eventually Scotland and places like that. And they certainly didn't pay any fines of any kind. And so they got off quite lightly. The idea behind them being sentenced and them being pushed to there was not the fact that they'd spend any length of time in the Tower of London or anything like that. It was just the king asserting himself and showing his power, showing that, yes, if you do this again, this will be a permanent state. You kind of listen to me and follow my ruling. And so when they did eventually come back, Morlais Castle wasn't then occupied by Gilbert de Clay's forces. Humphrey de Bohun didn't have any issues because he didn't have this castle filled with an opposing warlord who was incurring and pushing on his land anymore. And so the status quo kind of ensued. But they had more than enough to worry about with battles in Scotland and battles all over Wales, really, in this period. It was a very tumultuous time in Britain on every level, really. The one thing that you probably have got from all of this waffling on, as usual, is that this time period in history is so badly documented and kept. They are called the Dark Ages for a very specific reason. That is dark because there's such a lack of records to enlighten us, to bring to our attention what's going on. And Morlais Castle is a prime and perfect example of this, as we know little snippets. It's pushed a lot of people in Merthyr, particularly in the 19th century, to go investigating in Morlais Castle themselves. So if you look at Taliesin Williams, who was a schoolmaster and the son of Iolo Morgannwg, who lived in Merthyr, he went up there as this kind of typical Victorian antiquarian, doing little digs and investigations to try and find out what extent Morlais Castle was used, what was on there. And they would even go into the extent of getting little samples of the base of the forge where they made iron and steel and all that type of thing, and they would examine what the materials they were using. Lady Charlotte Guest went up there doing archaeological kind of digs herself and investigations with Taliesin and other people. The author of the History of Merthyr, Charles Wilkins, would go up there investigating and trying to map out the land and trying to put the mystery of Morlais Castle away, really, because Merthyr doesn't have much in the way of this Norman period kind of history, and it certainly doesn't have a castle like Morlais Castle. And so it intrigued a lot of people massively and pulled them in. And even Charles Wilkins actually writes down a memory of a person who lived in Merthyr who said that they vividly remember the larger of the tower, so the northern tower of Morlais Castle, still standing almost in its entirety, you know, in a ruined state, don't get me wrong, because there are some nice images of and paintings of Morlais Castle in the late 1700s, and so it's still in a ruined state, but there was much more of the foundations of the building standing, and certainly of the towers, by the late 1700s. But then apparently a massive storm hit around 1800, just after, and one minute the remains of Morlais Castle were there, and the next they were totally destroyed and washed away, and weather and time has just taken a lot of the castle away. I have waffled on a nice bit about this, but hopefully you've taken a bit of information about Morlais Castle and you've enjoyed the story of Morlais Castle a little bit. And so yeah, the next podcast will be out next week on Thursday. I'll keep secret what we're talking about there because I haven't fully worked it out yet. There's a few options, but hopefully I will speak to you all next week, and stay safe, and thank you very much for listening.